The story of Henry VII, aka How to Ruin England with a Six-Pack of Wives and a Whole Lot of Ego. Once upon a time in the cool mists of 1491 England, a baby boy was born with a very big destiny and probably a very smug look on his newborn face. His name Henry Tudor, second son to the rather stiff-lipped Henry VII, and his gentle wife Elizabeth of York, a political marriage made to end the Wars of the Roses, because nothing says romance like civil war and strategic unions. Now baby Henry wasn't supposed to be king. That job was reserved for his older brother Arthur, yes, like the heroine legend, because the Tudors were obsessed with PR even back then, but life and tuberculosis had other plans. Poor Arthur married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, then died at 15, leaving his little brother to inherit both the throne and his brother's widow. Classic Henry taking what isn't his before it's even fashionable. But let's not rush. First let's meet young Henry. He was tall, over 6 feet, which was basically NBA height in Tudor times. He had broad shoulders, auburn hair like polished mahogany, and those piercing blue eyes that screamed, "I may one day execute you if you disagree with me." He was handsome, athletic, and smelled faintly of ambition and roast venison. Young Henry was also very well educated: Latin, French, theology, music, poetry. He could do it all. He wrote sonnets, played the lute, wrestled courtiers, and jousted with a sword in one hand and divine entitlement in the other. Basically a Renaissance dreamboat with a god complex. Now his father Henry VIII was about as exciting as a boiled potato, cold, gray, and suspicious of everyone. So when Henry VIII kicked the royal bucket in 1509, the 17-year-old Henry VII ascended the throne with a big old sparkle in his eye and a party in his bones. He was ready to be the king of kings, and what did he do? First throw a wild coronation shower. The poor with riches twerk in tights. No, dear dreamer. He married Catherine of Aragon, yep, same Catherine, his brother's widow, and thus began one of the most infamous opera-level marital roller coasters in history. But let's put a pin in that. First let's talk about what kind of king Henry was becoming. At first Henry was adored. He was energetic, generous, and obsessed with chivalry, pageantry, and being seen as the most magnificent monarch in Europe. He threw feasts that would make Vegas blush. Imagine roast swans, fountains of wine, and more velvet than a medieval boy band. He loved music. He composed it. In fact, one of his best-known ditties is called Pastime with Good Company, which is exactly what he wanted his court to be. Just a shame he'd later fill it with sycophants, spies, and severed heads, but hey, who hasn't rebranded in their 40s? Henry also adored sports: jousting, yes, hunting, obviously tennis, you bet, real tennis though, which is way more confusing and medieval than the modern kind. He was basically a Tudor gym rat with a crown. Religiously, Henry started out as the ultimate Catholic boy. He even wrote a treatise attacking Martin Luther and defending the Pope, earning him the title Defender of the Faith. Spoiler, he would later rip up that title and fling it into the religious bonfire of his personal life. Henry believed he was God's chosen king, which unfortunately meant everything he wanted must be morally right, even when it was morally well, catastrophic. By his late 30s, Henry's shiny golden prince image was starting to smudge. He was still intelligent, still powerful, still lion-like, but now he was also impatient, suspicious, and increasingly tyrannical. He believed deeply in his own greatness, and anyone who didn't echo it off with their heads. So who was Henry really? He was a boy who was never meant to be king, a young man who dazzled with promise and power, a ruler who craved legacy, glory, and a son more than he craved truth. He loved music, theology, armor, and women, just not all at once, and he believed to the end that whatever he did was not only right but divinely ordained, even if that meant rewriting religion, reshaping England, and reducing his wives to a rhyme. The 6 wives of Henry VII, a royal lineup of love, loss, and lunacy: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Catchy, isn't it? That neat little rhyme has echoed through time, haunting textbooks and musicals alike, reducing 6 complex, intelligent, fascinating women into 6 brutal fates. But behind that rhyme lies a lifetime of drama, betrayal, passion, religion, politics, and one man's very confusing relationship with women, power, and his own legacy. Let's take a candlelit stroll through Henry's 6 marriages, shall we? Catherine of Aragon, divorced, the OG queen, Spanish royalty, dignified and deeply devout. She loved Henry, she respected the crown, she bore him Mary, but no surviving sons. For nearly 2 decades she held the throne with grace, but her greatest sin in Henry's eyes being too old to give him a boy and too proud to step aside. When she refused to quietly vanish, he broke with the Pope, created the Church of England, and cast her aside. Honestly, iconic behavior on both ends. Amber and beheaded, and witty, sharp, tonged, and ambitious. She wasn't going to be anyone's mistress. She wanted the crown, and she got it. But the very charm that enchanted Henry began to threaten him. She gave him Elizabeth, but no son. Accusations flew: adultery, incest, treason, mostly false unless you believe the most dramatic theories, and in a blaze of courtroom drama, Henry had her executed. Her head may have rolled, but her daughter would one day wear the crown. Jane Seymour died. The sweet, quiet peacemaker Jane was everything and wasn't submissive, soft-spoken, wheelie. Henry loved her most, or at least claimed He did why because she gave him his precious son Edward VI, and then conveniently died from postnatal complications before she could annoy him. He buried her next to him, which is romantic in a my favorite wife is the one who never disagreed with me kind of way, and of Cleves divorced sweet and the catfish. Wife Henry picked her based on a flattering portrait, met her in person and promptly declared she looked like a Flanders Mayouch. Their marriage was never consummated. No surprise he was sulking like a toddler with a bad toy, but and played the game like a pro. She agreed to the annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and lived happily ever after as the king's dear sister with a mansion and no stress. Honestly, she won. Catherine Howard beheaded a teenager, a flirt, a tragic firework. Catherine was in Bin's cousin and possibly one of Henry's most ill-advised choices. He was nearly 50, she was maybe 17. She brought excitement to his aging court, but her past and possibly present lovers caught up with her. When Henry found out, he cried, then executed her. Very on brand. Catherine Parr survived the final wife, educated, patient, and smart enough to stay alive. Catherine Parr was more nurse than lover. Henry was bloated, angry, and ulcer-ridden by then. She cared for his children, soothed his temper, and quietly stayed in his good graces while secretly promoting Protestant reform. She outlived him. Then she remarried like a boss. So there you have it, 6 women, 6 very different fates, one very dramatic king, and through it all Henry changed not just his wives but his country, his religion, and himself. What began as the story of a golden prince turned into a Shakespearean epic full of heartbreak, ambition, and absurdly puffy sleeves. But don't worry, dear dreamer, this is only the beginning. Now that you've met the man and glimpsed his queens, will take each of their hands and walk through their stories one by one, each a tapestry in its own right. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of Hearts, first wife and unbothered icon of the Tudor court. Once upon a time, long before England even thought about arguing with the Pope over divorce, a little girl was born in Spain, swaddled in silk and royal expectations. The year was 1485, and her name was Catalina de Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella the First of Castile. Yes, that Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who kicked the Moors out of Spain, financed Christopher Columbus, and had a very busy time reinventing Catholic Europe. Catherine was princess from birth, warrior by blood, queen by destiny. From the moment she could toddle around the palace, Catherine was groomed for greatness. She studied Latin, philosophy, history, music, and theology, and she could probably out-debate a monk before she hit puberty. She was also raised in an atmosphere of religious intensity. Spain at that time was in full-on crusade mode, and Catherine absorbed the belief that her role in life was to serve God and crown. Also, not to brag, but she was fluent in Latin, rode horses like a champion, and could so dance and pray all before lunch. At the tender age of 15, Catherine sailed across the sea to marry Prince Arthur, the Crown Prince of England, and Henry VII, older brother. The wedding was big, the politics were bigger, and everyone expected a long and fruitful royal future. Instead, Arthur died 5 months later. Was it consumption? Was it England's wet weather and dull food? Was it the fact that they were literal teenagers forced into a political honeymoon? We may never know, but what we do know is this: Catherine, widowed and stranded in a strange cold land, declared that the marriage had never been consummated, that one sentence would shape the rest of her life. After Arthur's death, poor Catherine was stuck in a miserable limbo. Technically, she was still a princess, but also technically she was a political pawn with no husband and no clear future. Her dowry was in limbo. Her reputation was hanging by a very Spanish thread. She lived in relative obscurity for 7 long years, waiting for fate and royal bureaucracy to decide what to do with her. Then fate showed up with ginger hair and legs for days. Enter Prince Henry. When Henry VIII died and the 17-year-old Henry VII took the throne, one of his first royal moves was to marry Catherine. She was 5 years older, educated, beautiful in a delicate, refined way, and had the Spanish alliance in her bridal gift basket. He seemed truly fond of her. For a time they were the golden couple of England. Catherine became Queen of England, and she thrived in the role. She was dignified, adored by the people, fluent in ceremony and compassion. She even ruled as regent while Henry was off playing war, and crushed a Scottish rebellion at the Battle of Flodden while heavily pregnant. Like the absolute legend she was, but there was one problem, one insurmountable M-shaped problem. Henry wanted a son, and Catherine gave him Mary. Catherine endured at least 6 pregnancies, but only one child survived infancy: Princess Mary, the future Mary the First. Still, Catherine didn't falter. She believed with all her heart that it was God's will. She remained loyal to Henry, loving and proud, but Henry was getting twitchy. He convinced himself their lack of sons was punishment for marrying his brother's wife, even though he was the one who pushed for the marriage in the first place. The mental gymnastics, dear dreamer, were worthy of an Olympic Gold and then came in Bellin and things went from mildly awkward to catastrophic. Henry wanted a divorce. Catherine naturally refused. She fought back like a lioness defending her cub. She argued her case in court. She stood before bishops, nobles, and even the Pope and declared she was Henry's true lawful wife. She famously knelt before him and said, "I have been to you a true wife, humble and obedient, and if it were not to the displeasure of God I would rather be buried than put away." Mic drop. But Henry had already decided with Bean whispering in his ear and his ego howling for a son. He broke from the Catholic Church, invented his own because why not, and declared the marriage null. Catherine was banished from court. She was stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, and sent to live in increasingly bleak castles. She refused to accept her demotion, insisting to the end that she was Henry's one true wife and England's rightful queen. She died in 1536 at age 50, alone but not broken, and when her embed heart was later found to be blackened, some whispered poison, but I prefer to think it was simply too full of sorrow. Catherine of Aragon was faith to her God, her crown, and her daughter. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and deeply loved by the English people. Even in exile, she carried herself with the grace of a queen and the iron will of a general. She lost the crown, she lost her husband, but she never lost her dignity, and as her daughter Mary would one day take the throne, Catherine's bloodline would burn bright once more, if only for a little while, and been crowned by love, undone by power. Once upon a time in the late 15th century, in the lush, leafy countryside of Kent, a baby girl was born into a family whose ambition ran nearly as deep as the royal bloodlines they sought to impress. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and while the exact year of her birth remains debated, some say 1501, others 1507, what is beyond question is that this child would grow into a woman who would turn the kingdom of England upside down, not with armies or armor, but with intellect, intrigue, and a dazzling, dangerous kind of charm, and was not the daughter of a king or even a duchess. Her father, Thomas B, was a skilled diplomat, sharp-tongued and tireless in his pursuit of status, while her mother Elizabeth Howard came from one of the most noble families in England. Together they gave Anne a childhood shaped not by grand castles and royal protocols, but by education, exposure, and expectation. And wasn't raised to be docile, she was raised to shine at a young age, and was sent abroad to serve in the courts of the continent, where she received an education far richer and more sophisticated than what most English ladies of the time could ever dream. First she went to the court of the Archduchess Margaret in the Netherlands, where she learned languages, etiquette, and diplomacy. Then she traveled to France to serve Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I, and it was there that Anne truly bloomed, immersing herself in French fashion, art, courtly flirtation, and the he ideals of the Renaissance. She learned how to speak not just eloquently but seductively, with nuance and wit, and she returned to England fluent in both language and allure. By the time she stepped into the court of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn was not just beautiful, though her dark eyes, olive skin, and long elegant neck certainly turned heads. She was poised, she was clever, she was magnetic, unlike her sister Mary, who had previously been the king's mistress and was often dismissed as a pleasant but forgettable affair and demanded more. She refused to be one more name in the king's little black book. If he wanted her, he would have to make her his wife, and so began one of the most infamous and transformational romances in European history. Henry VII, already married to Catherine of Aragon, was captivated utterly and irrevocably by Anne's spirit. She was not compliant or simpering like the ladies he was used to. She was confident, challenging, and tantalizingly elusive, and the stakes were impossibly high. Becoming the king's mistress might elevate her family's fortunes, yes, but to aim for the crown itself, that required precision, ambition, and nerves of steel. Henry pursued her obsessively, writing her impassioned love letters filled with longing and jealousy, promising her anything, everything, if she would just be his. Yes, we still have them. Yes, they're juicy, but, and calculating and cautious, refused to yield until he put a crown on her head. She would not be another discarded favorite. She would be queen for Henry. The pursuit turned into obsession, and obsession turned into desperation. He appealed to the Pope for an annulment from Catherine, citing scriptures and divine punishment, claiming his marriage to his brother's widow was cursed by God, as evidenced by Catherine's failure to bear him a living male heir. But the Pope, entangled in the politics of Europe and not keen to anger Catherine's nephew, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles I, refused to grant it. So Henry did what any self-absorbed, power-drunk monarch might do when faced with resistance. He declared himself the new head of the Church of England, split from Rome, and forced his nation to choose between obedience to the Pope and loyalty to their increasingly unhinged king. In 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married shortly after, and was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony, one as grand as any monarch's coronation, though not without its murmur and side eyes from a public who still adored Catherine, and now visibly pregnant walked proudly through Westminster Abbey in golden robes, basking in the moment she had so carefully orchestrated. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. and gave birth later that year to a daughter Elizabeth, a brilliant fiery child destined to become one of the most legendary monarchs in history. But Henry at the time was bitterly disappointed. He had risked his soul and torn his kingdom apart for Anne, and what he wanted, needed, demanded was a son. Anne's power, so swiftly gained, began to slip. Though she remained Henry's wife and queen, her position was never secure. She had made many enemies in court, too opinionated, too influential, too much like the king himself in her refusal to play the obedient wife. Her second and third pregnancies ended in miscarriage, one of them tragically occurring after a shock, perhaps from witnessing Henry fall during a jousting accident, or from hearing of his growing flirtation with a quiet lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. The very court that once applauded her rise now whispered of her downfall. By 1536, only 3 years after she became queen and was arrested and brought to the Tower of London, the charges against her were both shocking and suspiciously convenient: adultery, incest, treason. Her own brother was among the accused. The trial, as you can imagine, was less a legal proceeding and more a royal execution in slow motion. And ever eloquent and composed, defended herself fiercely, but it was clear the verdict had been written long before the trial even began. On May 19, Anne was led to the scaffold. She wore a dark gown and a mantle of grace, her hair tucked under the infamous French hood that had become her signature. She gave a final speech, dignified, calm, eerily serene, and she did not blame the king. She praised him, in fact, as was expected of a queen facing death, and then with one clean stroke of a French executioner's sword she was gone. She was just over 30 years old. Ellen's story did not end with her death. It began there, because the daughter she bore, Elizabeth, would run to become one of the greatest rulers the world has ever known, and the reformation she triggered with her marriage would echo through centuries, changing not just England but the very landscape of Western religion. And was not a victim, nor simply a villain, or even just a queen. She was a revolution wrapped in silk and steel. She was a woman who dared to ask for more, and though the world tried to cut her down to size, her shadow stretches across history. Still now, dear dreamer, close your eyes but not your ears, for another queen waits just behind the veil. She was quiet where Anne was bold, yielding where Anne was fiery, and yet in the king's eyes she was the one who gave him the one thing he wanted more than love or loyalty, a son. Jane Seymour, the quiet queen, who gave England its precious prince in a world ablaze with ambition, egos, and the eternal chess game of core politics. Jane Seymour entered history not with a thunderclap but with a whisper, soft, silken, and laced with the kind of understated resolve that would eventually captivate a king and secure her place in the turbulent tapestry of the Tudor court. She was no great beauty, no fiery intellect, no scandalous temptress. She wasn't a revolution like Anne Boleyn, nor a royal powerhouse like Catherine of Aragon, but she was something far rarer in Henry VIII's orbit. She was quiet, careful, and clever enough to survive, at least for a while. Born around 1508 at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, Jane came from an old and respectable noble family, though one far less ambitious or ostentatious than the Binns. Her father, Sir John Seymour, had served Henry loyally for years, and her mother, Margaret Wentworth, was known for her gentle wisdom and piety. Jane, one of children, was raised in a household where discipline, obedience, and modesty were the prized virtues, and perhaps nowhere were those lessons more deeply internalized than in Jane herself. She was not particularly well educated compared to her predecessors, unlike and who spoke French, Latin, and sarcasm fluently. Jane's talents lay more in needlework, music, and household management, but she had something far more powerful in the tea to court than languages, or which she understood, silence. Jane knew how to listen, how to nod, how to float through dangerous rooms without leaving footprints, and in the treacherous halls of Henry's court that made her utterly lethal in the most gentle cinnamon toast kind of way. Jane served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, and later to Anne Boleyn, which means she was perfectly positioned to witness both the rise and the brutal downfall of the two queens who came before her. She saw Catherine cast aside after decades of loyalty, and she saw Anne's meteoric climb to power crumble under the weight of lost pregnancies, shifting political winds, and Henry's ever-mounting frustration. And Jane, she waited while and fought fiercely to hold her crown. Jane stayed close to the king, but never too close. She allowed herself to be noticed, not chased. She never argued, never demanded. She offered Henry something he hadn't had in years: peace, simplicity, and the promise of a fresh start. Some say she played the role of the demure maiden with deliberate precision, accepting Henry's gifts but refusing to become his mistress unless she were made his wife. Others say she was merely a pawn in a game orchestrated by her ambitious brothers Edward and Thomas Seymour, who saw in her pale hands the key to rising in the ranks of power. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: Henry fell hard, and as Anne's fortunes declined, especially after her final miscarriage in January 1536, Jane's star began to rise. By May of that same year, Anne Boleyn was dead, executed on charges that still stir debate among historians and dramatists alike. Just 11 days later, Henry and Jane were Married, no grandpa, no mourning period, just a swift pivot from one queen's grave to another's wedding. Chamber. As Queen Jane Seymour was everything and Boleyn had not been meek, mild, and politically cautious. She restored order to the royal household, brought back many of the customs and courtiers who had been ousted under Anne, and she worked quietly to reconcile Henry with his estranged daughter Mary, whom he had declared illegitimate after divorcing Catherine of Aragon. Jane may have been reserved, but she was not without influence. She knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. The one time she did challenge Henry, pleading for the restoration of Catholic monasteries and speaking out against the harsh treatment of religious rebels during the Pilgrimage of Grace, he reportedly snapped that she should remember what happened to the last queen who meddled. Jane never pressed the issue again. Instead, she focused all her energy on the role that would define her legacy: motherhood. In the autumn of 1537, after more than a year of pregnancy, struggles, and mounting pressure, Jane Seymour gave birth to what Henry had long considered the true purpose of marriage itself: a healthy, legitimate male heir. The child, named Edward, was born after a difficult labor that lasted 2 days and 3 nights, an exhausting, excruciating ordeal that left Jane physically weakened and dangerously ill. Still, the birth was heralded with nationwide celebration. Bells rang out across England, bonfires were lit, people danced in the streets. Henry VII, finally, after years of marriage's heartbreak and political havoc, had a son, and Jane, for the first time in her life, she had everything: a crown, the king's devotion, and the child that made her not just queen but the mother of the future of England. But fate, cruel as ever in Ted Tales, had other plans. Only 12 days later, Jane Seymour died, likely of puerperal fever, a common and often fatal infection following childbirth. Her death plunged the court into genuine mourning. Even Henry, not known for his emotional vulnerability, unless screaming at someone counts, was truly devastated. He wore black for months. He did not remarry for several years. He declared that Jane had been his true wife, the only one to give him what he'd always wanted, and when his own end finally came, he asked to be buried beside her. Jane Seymour ruled for only 17 months, and in that short time she left behind no scandal, no disgrace, and in no rebellion. She didn't reshape religion or write passionate letters or fall from grace with a sword at her neck, but she did what no other wife of Henry VII could do. She delivered a son, secured her fame's rise to power, and died before the king could turn on her. History remembers her as quiet, modest, even boring, but there is cunning in silence and power in stillness. In a court of roaring lions and shrieking hawks, Jane Seymour was the white D, graceful, elusive, and gone far too soon. And now, dear dreamer, as the shadows lengthen and the echoes of courtly lullabies drift through the corridors, another figure appears in the doorway of time. She wears no crown, only a knowing smile and a sharp sense of timing. She came with a flattering portrait, she left with a royal pension and absolutely no head. Trine of Cleves, the queen who knew when to fold him, the woman who married the most dangerous man in England and still somehow managed to walk away richer, safer, and with a better real estate portfolio than most modern influences. Our story begins not in the elegant chaos of England's court, but far across the Channel in the quieter, more structured duet of Cleves. Nestled in what we now call Germany, it was the early 16th century, and young and born in 1515 was being raised far from the scandal-soaked pages of Tudor history. She would one day headline, and wasn't a royal, but she was noble, the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria of Ulburg, rulers of a region known for its piety, modesty, and, let's say, more practical than glamorous upbringing. The girls in Cleves didn't spend their days perfecting court dances or learning to flirt in French. They were educated, certainly, but in more restrained domestic discipline: sewing, music, and how to walk around without tripping over a 30-foot skirt, presumably unlike the English court, where every glance was a game and every smile could be a trap. And grew up in an environment that valued stillness, humility, and simplicity, and for a while she likely imagined her life would be much like her homeland, structured, respectable, and free of beheadings. But across the sea, King Henry VII was once again in search of a wife, and Anne's name had just made the short list. By 1539, Henry was a 3-time widower. Catherine of Aragon had been divorced and exiled, and Bellin had been dramatically shortened, and Jane Seymour, sweet Jane, had tragically died after giving him the long-awaited son. Now, at nearly 5,050 years old, Henry was lonely, a bit grumpy, and also increasingly festively plump. He was still powerful, still dangerous, but his mirror no longer reflected the golden prince of years past. Meanwhile, Europe was a political pressure cooker. England was drifting away from Catholic Rome and needed Protestant allies. The Duke of Cleves, being Protestant and in a strategic location, looked like a promising partner, and wouldn't you know it, he had an unmarried daughter. A treaty was proposed, a marriage discussed, but Henry, ever the romantic and definitely not shallow at all, wanted to see what he was getting himself into before signing any royal contract. Enter Hans Hollein, Court painter and unsuspecting bringer of chaos Hein was dispatched to paint and's portrait a formal flattering image of a serene young woman with delicate features, and rich gowns. Henry saw the finished painting, and was instantly smitten. She's a looker, he likely said while dabbing turkey grease from his chin. Let's do this, and for her part had no idea what she was walking into. In January 1540, Anne of Cleves arrived in England. The court buzzed. Henry was thrilled. He planned a surprise meeting. Because what better way to greet your future wife than ambushing her in disguise like a sweaty Shakespearean character? Unfortunately, this did not go well when Henry burst into her chambers pretending to be a gallant stranger, because Henry loved a bit of role-play, and who had been raised in a strict and proper environment where that kind of behavior was considered wildly inappropriate, responded with a very polite "Who are you and why are you touching me?" energy. Henry, humiliated and instantly deflated, figuratively, don't worry, decided he had been catfished by a portrait. He reportedly called her a Flanders May behind closed doors, a cruel, infamous remark that likely had more to do with his own insecurity than her actual appearance. Most accounts agree that Anne was attractive, if not in the overly polished Frenchified way Henry preferred. She just didn't sparkle with flirtation or flattery, and to a man like Henry that was practically treason. Still, a treaty had been signed, the wedding date was set, the alliance was crucial. So despite his grumbles, Henry married, and on January 6, 1540, to say the marriage was a disaster is generous. Henry claimed he couldn't consummate the union, citing a lack of attraction. Some historians suggest it was more about his health, ulcers, mood swings, and the crushing realization that he wasn't as virile as he once was, and for her part was likely confused and bewildered. She'd done everything asked of her. She dressed correctly, she spoke graciously, she tried her best, but Henry's affections were already drifting this time to a young flirtatious lady in waiting named Catherine Howard. The writing was on the stone castle wall by June. Henry wanted out, and Anne, instead of fighting, pleading, or weeping like her predecessors, she did something extraordinary. She agreed. She said yes. She let him go. She accepted the annulment, citing non-see consummation and pre-contracts of betrothal, and in return she won the sweet life of not being married to Henry VII. Anne of Cleves was granted a generous settlement. She received Havre Castle, ironically the former been estate, several manors, jewels, staff, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. She remained in England, attended royal events, and even got along surprisingly well with Henry and his children, particularly Princess Elizabeth, who visited her frequently. She never remarried. She never returned to Cleves, and unlike most of Henry's wives, she never suffered disgrace, imprisonment, or a sudden drop in neck height. She lived comfortably for another 17 years, outliving Henry. Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. She died in 1557 at the age of 41 or 42, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to rest there. History often brushes past Anne of Cleves as the ugly one, the failed marriage, the brief idyll between the drama of Anne Boleyn and the tragedy of Catherine Howard, but that's not fair, not even close. And was wise, she was diplomatic, she had enough self-preservation instinct to recognize that when you're married to a man with a sword and a short temper, sometimes surrender is survival. She wasn't the wife Henry wanted, but she was the only one who left on her own terms, kept her head, kept her money, and most importantly kept her peace. And now, dear dreamer, as the candles burn lower and the air thickens with secrets, the next queen waits in the shadows. She's young, too young, beautiful, lively, naive, and her story will end far more like Anne Boleyn's than Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard, the rose without a thorn and the crown without a future, the girl who danced too close to the fire. Once upon a time, not so long after Anne of Cleves had made her graceful exit from Henry's suffocating affection, a new presence drifted into the royal court like a perfume on summer air, sweet, bright, intoxicating, and utterly doomed. Her name was Catherine Howard, and she was barely more than a girl when she caught the eye of a king old enough to be her grandfather and dangerous enough to be her executioner, born sometime around 1523, a date that makes historians sigh and shuffle. Catherine was a cousin of the infamous Anne Boleyn, which should have come with a warning label stamped "Handle with care, may attract kings and misfortune." She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a man who, to put it kindly, was not exactly thriving. He had more debts than dignity, and the Howard family, though noble, was spread thin across England like old butter on burnt toast. When Catherine was still very young, her mother died, and her father, likely overwhelmed and underqualified, sent her off to live under the care of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in what can generously be called a Tudor girl boss boarding school, and less generously described as absolute chaos with embroidery. Catherine's upbringing was informal. The Duchess's household was large, lively, and alarmingly under-supervised. It was there that Catherine, still barely into her teens, was exposed to flirtations, music, stolen kisses behind tapestries, and men who treated Courtship like sport. Two such men, Henry Manx, her music teacher, and Francis Derham, a more forward suitor, played a significant role in her early life, and while modern historians still debate the full extent of those entanglements, what's certain is that Catherine's name was already attached to rumors long before she ever wore a crown, and then suddenly everything changed in 1540. At just about 17 years old, Catherine was appointed Lady-in-Waiting to the newly Crown and of Cleves, and it was therein the glittering court of silks and secrets that King Henry VII, now 50 overweight and plagued by ulcers both physical and emotional, noticed the pretty giggling teenager with chestnut hair and dimples like sweet wine to Henry. Catherine Howard was a second spring, a last breath of youth before the grave. She was vivacious, charming, full of laughter, and most importantly, she seemed absolutely delighted by him. Whether that delight was genuine or part of a careful performance we may never know, but to the king, who was increasingly bitter and bloated, Catherine was a balb, a distraction, a dream. By July 1540, just 19 days after he annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry married Catherine Howard. She became Queen of England, a teenager on the arm of a man who now wore padding under his robes and needed help getting upstairs, but she played the part well, dancing, smiling, doting, even calling him her rose without a thorn, which was a wildly optimistic nickname for a man who had already executed one wife and tossed another aside like yesterday's roast goose. Still, for a moment, Catherine shone. She wore jewels like they'd been made for her. She threw parties, embraced music, and revived the youthful glamour of Henry's earlier reign, but shadows from her past were beginning to stir at court. Whispers are currency and secrets are weapons. As Catherine settled into her role, Francis Derham, the former flame from her wild teenage days, arrived at court and tried to position himself for power. Whether she gave him a position out of fear, affection, or blackmail is unclear, but his presence was a fatal error. Even more dangerous, Catherine had begun a new affair, this time with Thomas C. Pepper, a gentleman of the King's Chamber, young, handsome, and close to hen. Their relationship, possibly romantic, possibly physical, was reckless in ways only a teenager in a crown could manage. The meetings were arranged in secret with the help of one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Bellin. Yes, that Jane Bellin, the widow of and Bellin's brother, who had already seen one queen fall and was apparently ready to roll the dice again. But in court, where nothing stayed secret for long, the rumors soon reached the ears of Archbishop Cranmer, and from there they galloped straight to the king. The moment Henry learned of the allegations against Catherine, everything stopped. He had loved her, or at least loved the way she made him feel young again. The betrayal, whether real or exaggerated by gossip, struck him like an axe to the heart. He wept, he raged, he refused to see her, refused to believe it, and then demanded proof. And once he had it, letters, testimonies, confessions, his grief turned, as it always did, into vengeance. Catherine was stripped of her title, confined to her rooms, and eventually imprisoned in Sion Abbey, where she descended into panic, unlike Anne Bean, who had met her death with eerie calm. Catherine unraveled. She begged for mercy, she screamed, she went temporarily mad with fear. When told she would be executed, she asked for the block to be brought to her, so she could practice laying her head upon it. She was barely 18 on February 13, 1542. Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London. She wore a black velvet gown, her hair unbound. She confessed, she prayed, and then she laid her head upon the block and joined the long list of women who had loved the wrong man at the wrong moment in history. Catherine Howard's story is tragic, not just because of how it ended, but because of how little time she had to live it. She was no schemer, no seductress with a master plan. She was a child tossed into the lion's den of politics, a pawn in the hands of powerful families, and a girl whose charm turned into her death sentence. She wasn't perfect, but she was never truly prepared. She made mistakes, yes, but she also brought joy to a man no one else could please, and she laughed, danced, and loved even when the walls were closing. She is remembered often as foolish, but she deserves to be remembered as human. And now, dear dreamer, as the candle flickers low and the palace halls fall quiet, there is one more queen waiting to be heard. She was clever, gentle, and finally the last wife to survive him, Catherine Parr, the queen who read books, dodged blades, and buried her husband. There are women who were born to be queens, and then there are women who become queens because they were just too smart, too strong, and frankly too organized to avoid it. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VII, was most definitely the latter. She didn't arrive at court with starry eyes or grand dreams of royal romance. By the time Henry came knocking, Reed lumbering at her door, Catherine had already lived through 2 husbands, 1 plague outbreak, several religious revolutions, and at least a dozen reasons not to get involved with a man known for solving marital problems with an axe. But get involved she did, because this dear dreamer is not just a love story, it's a survival guide in a corset. Catherine Parr was born in 1512, the daughter of S. Thomas Parr, a courtier and close friend of Henry VII. Yes, that Henry he really did get everywhere. Her mother Mud Green was a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon and passed along not just courtly skills but a deep admiration for the original queen's dignity and strength, qualities young Catherine would one day come to embody in her own right. Unlike some of Henry's other wives, Catherine's early life was filled not with luxury but with loss and learning. Her father died when she was young, and her first two marriages, first to Edward Berg, a sickly nobleman, and then to John Neville Baron Latimer, a kindly older widower with political baggage, were more about duty than desire. She spent years managing households, acting as a stepmother, surviving rebellions, and quietly becoming one of the most well-educated women in England. Catherine spoke several languages, read Latin and Greek, and was deeply interested in religion, not the rigid Catholicism of her youth, but the budding wave of Protestant reform that was sweeping through Europe like wildfire and making everyone either enlightened or deeply suspicious, depending on their level of hat wearing. By the time she was widowed a second time, Catherine was 30, older than most brides, twice a widow, and perfectly content, it seemed, to retire from romance and live a quiet life of study and devotion. And then, of course, Henry VII showed up at this point in the story. Henry was 15'3", obese, chronically ill, prone to mood swings, paranoia, and gout so bad he could barely walk. He also smelled like infected leg ulcers, very hot. Still, he was the King of England, and when he decided he wanted something or someone, that Henry noticed Catherine's kindness, her intellect, and her poise, and much to her dismay, he also noticed her beauty, which by all accounts was quiet and graceful. She was tall, fair, and carried herself with dignity rather than drama. In short, she wasn't going to throw tantrums, plot affairs, or demand revolutions after 5 previous wives. That sounded extremely appealing, but here's the twist: Catherine didn't want to marry him. Her heart actually belonged to another man, Thomas Seymour, a dashing courtier and, yes, brother to the late Jane Seymour. The Tudors were really a closed-loop system, but when the king proposes, even if he's slightly oozing and terrifying, you say yes. And so in 1543, Catherine Parr became Queen of England. As Queen, Catherine's life was a balancing act of jaw-dropping complexity. She was married to a volatile monarch, helping raise his 3 surviving children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each with very different religious upbringings and political faiths. She was also working quietly but powerfully to reconcile the royal family, especially Henry and his daughters, who had been cast out of the line of succession. Catherine's court was calm, cultured, and intellectual. She surrounded herself with scholars, poets, and theologians. She even wrote and published books, a first for any queen of England. Her most famous, Prayers or Meditations, was a bestseller of its time, which in Tudor England meant not immediately banned and burned, but her interest in Protestant reform soon drew suspicion. Catherine read banned texts, hosted reformist thinkers, and even argued theology with Henry, which was a dangerous game when your husband had a history of turning theological disagreements into public executions. At one point, Henry became convinced, or was convinced by others, that Catherine was a heretic. A warrant for her arrest was reportedly drawn up, but Catherine, in a stunning display of quick thinking and survival instinct, went to the king, threw herself at his swollen feet, and said she had only ever argued with him to distract him from his pain and show her loyalty. Henry flattered and soothed, cancelled the arrest. She survived again. Catherine's luck held. In 1547, just 4 years after their marriage, Henry VII died. She was his 6th wife, and the only one to outlive him. She was finally free, but instead of slipping into quiet widowhood, Catherine did something surprising. She married for love openly and swiftly. Within a few months of Henry's death, she reunited with Thomas Seymour, the charming man she had wanted to marry before the king claimed her. This should have been her fairy tale ending. Unfortunately, it was a mess. Thomas was ambitious, flirtatious, and let's just say not very good at not creeping on teenage girls. While married to Catherine, he grew a little too fond of young Princess Elizabeth, who was living in their household at the time. The whole affair was awkward, scandalous, and emotionally devastating for Catherine, who had spent so many years surviving the storm, only to find herself betrayed in her own home. Still, she bore Thomas a daughter, her only child, and died shortly after childbirth in 1548, likely of puerperal fever, the same fate that had claimed Jane Seymour before her. She was just 36 years old. Catherine Parr was not the most famous of Henry's wives, nor the most tragic, nor the most scandalous, but in many ways she was the strongest. She used her intelligence, her compassion, and her formidable patience not just to survive but to lead to influence and to leave a mark on England that extended far beyond the crown. She brought peace to a fractured royal family. She raised a future Queen, Elizabeth I, and modeled a kind of power that didn't require a sword or a scream. She loved, lost, loved again, and in the end she chose herself. And so ends the tale of the 6 wives of Henry VII, 6 women, 6 lives each, forever altered by one man. Need for a son, a legacy, and a love he never quite deserved. Some were discarded, some were destroyed, one outlasted him, and all of them, dear dreamer, lived on in the pages of history as queens, as survivors, and as the enduring echo of a crown that never did sit quite still. And now, after all the drama and heartbreak of the 6 wives, it's time to meet the daughter of heartbreak itself, Mary Tudor. She was the child of a marriage that ended in exile, the girl who watched her world fall apart before she was even old enough to understand why. The first woman to ever rule England in her own right, and the Queen history has both feared and misunderstood. So pull up your royal velvet blanket, take a deep dreamy breath, and let's walk into a tale steeped in sorrow, survival, and fire. Mary Tudor, the Queen with a crown of thorns and a heart full of ashes. Long before she was known by the name that would make even school children wince, Bloody Mary, there was a little girl with red gold hair, delicate hands, and eyes filled with longing. She was born in 1516, the long-awaited daughter of King Henry VII and Queen Catherine of Aragon, and though she was not the male heir her father desperately craved, she was deeply loved by her mother, adored by courtiers, and at least for a time cherished by the king himself. Her early childhood was one of elegance and privilege. Little Mary Tudor was doted upon, dressed in silks, and educated like a prince rather than a princess. Henry saw in her the future of his legacy, if not a king then a queen who might marry well, bind alliances, and carry on the Tudor name. She was witty, charming, and precociously intelligent, mastering Latin, French, music, and theology before most children could write their own names. But love in Tudor England was no guarantee of stability, and Mary's world was about to break. When Henry VII decided to divorce her mother Catherine of Aragon, everything changed for Mary. She was just 11 when her father began his infamous pursuit of and Borin, and by the time she was a teenager her mother had been banished, stripped of her title, and separated from her child. Mary, once England's beloved princess, was declared illegitimate, downgraded to Lady Mary, and forbidden from seeing her mother. War. Still, she was forced to serve in the household of her new half-sister Elizabeth, the baby born of Henry's second marriage to a proud, devout, heartbroken teenager. This was just a demotion, it was a humiliation. Catherine, even in exile, urged her daughter to stand firm, to refuse to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen or Elizabeth as legitimate, and Mary did bravely, stubbornly for years. But when her mother died in 1536 alone and in disgrace, Mary lost the only person who had ever truly protected her, and broken by grief and the threat of royal wrath, she was forced to sign a document renouncing her claim to the throne and acknowledging her father as supreme head of the Church of England. It was a betrayal of her soul, and she never quite forgave herself. The years that followed were strange and quiet. Mary lived like a ghost in her own father's court, present but never truly seen. She was allowed back into favor somewhat, but was always watched, always treated with suspicion. The Protestant Reformation was taking root in England, and Mary, a staunch Catholic like her mother, was seen as a relic of the old faith, a threat to the new order. When Henry died in 1547, her younger half-brother Edward VI ascended the throne at just 9 years old, surrounded by Protestant advisors who wanted to stamp out Catholicism for good. Under his reign, Mary was once again pressured, prodded, and persecuted, told to abandon her religion, to worship in English, to forget the Mass and the saints and the Latin prayers that had once been the heartbeat of her soul. She refused quietly but fiercely. Even as her friends were arrested, even as she was threatened with imprisonment, Mary endured. She had learned to survive in silence. She had learned that sometimes the safest thing to do was to wait. And then her chance came when Edward died in 1553 at just 15 years old. He and his council tried to prevent Mary from inheriting the crown. They declared Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin and devout Protestant, as queen instead. But they underestimated Mary. They thought her weak. They thought her forgotten. They thought she had no allies. They were wrong. Mary, now 37, rode out from her manor with banners flying, and England rose up around her. Peasants and nobles alike rallied to her side. Her faith, her bloodline, and her unbroken dignity inspired a revolution. Lady Jane's reign lasted 9 days. Mary rode into London to thunderous cheers. For the first time in English history, a woman had claimed the throne by right, not marriage, and for a moment all of her suffering seemed to lead to this: a crown, a throne, a triumph. But ruling is not the same as surviving, and Mary, though a queen, at last ruled a kingdom that no longer resembled the world she had been raised in. She was a Catholic queen in a Protestant land, a woman ruler in a man's world, and though she sought peace and unity, her reign soon spiraled into suspicion, rebellion, and infamy. Determined to restore England to the Catholic faith, Mary reversed Edward's reforms, reinstated the Pope's authority, and married Philip II of Spain, a political union meant to strengthen ties with her mother's homeland. But the people hated the match. Philip was foreign, cold, and ambitious, and Mary loved him more than he ever loved her. And then came the burnings. In her efforts to restore Catholicism, Mary's government executed nearly 300 Protestants, burning them at the stake for heresy. It was brutal, public, unforgivable. The people, once so loyal, began to fear her, to call her Bloody Mary. But Mary, she truly believed she was saving souls. She was not a sadist, she was a believer, a zealot, a woman whose childhood had been shattered by religious upheaval, trying desperately to make England whole again in the only way she knew how. Mary's marriage was a failure. Philly spent most of his time abroad. She suffered multiple false pregnancies, her belly swelling with hope that turned to heartbreak again and again. She longed for a child, not just to continue the Tudor line but to keep the throne out of the hands of her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, but no child came. By 1558 Mary was physically broken, racked with pain, possibly from ovarian cancer or some undiagnosed infection. Her heart was heavy, her people restless, and her legacy already beginning to slip into darkness. She died on November 17th at the age of 42, leaving the crown to the very sister she had tried to disinherit. She was buried in Westminster Abbey beneath a plain slab. Years later, Elizabeth would be buried in the same tomb, and the inscription would read, "Partners both in throne and grave." And isn't that the most tore thing of all? History remembers her as Bloody Mary, the queen who burned her people, but she was also the little girl who lost her mother, the princess who was cast aside, the sister who fought for her crown, and the woman who ruled not with charm or ambition but with sheer relentless endurance. She was not a perfect queen, but she was a queen, and she paved the way for the greatest monarch England would ever know. And now, dear dreamer, the candles flicker brighter, not dimmer, for in the shadows of Mary's sorrow a flame is about to rise, brilliant, defiant, dazzling in her defiance. Elizabeth I, the queen who turned her ruin into a reign of glory. When Elizabeth Tudor was born on the 7th of September, 1533, in the sumptuous halls of Greenwich Palace, with the autumn light slipping through stained glass windows and the air thick with hope and anxiety, her arrival was not greeted with the joyous fanfare that her parents had desperately anticipated, for she was not the boy her father had torn his kingdom apart to produce, not the male heir around whom he had restructured the very spiritual and political foundations of his nation, but instead she was a girl, a delicate red-haired disappointment wrapped in swaddling cloth and shadows of expectation. Her mother, the infamous and dazzling Anne Boleyn, had risen like lightning through the court, clever and provocative, a woman whose ambition had cost Henry his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his alliance with the Pope, and his religious reputation. And now that her womb had not delivered the promised son, her political foothold began to crumble like old parchment left out in the rain. By the time Elizabeth was barely 3, she had lost everything that once ensured her future. Her title as princess revoked, her place in the succession rendered illegitimate by parliamentary decree, and her mother and executed by her father's order on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations as politically charged as they were likely untrue. From that moment onward, Elizabeth's childhood was shaped by the strange paradox of being both royal and irrelevant, important enough to monitor, but never quite welcome, sent to live in distant houses, shuffling between households like an afterthought, raised by stepmothers who came and went like the turning seasons, and watched by a father who, while sometimes affectionate, could never quite meet her eyes without remembering the ghost of the wife he had destroyed. And yet, despite her precarious status, Elizabeth was educated beyond the expectations of her gender, trained like a prince rather than a lady, entrusted to tutors who cultivated her fierce intelligence and taught her the disciplines of Latin, Greek, French, theology, logic, rhetoric, philosophy, and the histories of both classical antiquity and the tumultuous world unfolding just beyond the castle walls. By the time she was 10, Elizabeth could debate scholars, translate ancient texts, and write poetry with elegance and wit. By the time she was 15, she was not only fluent in 6 languages but had developed the sharp observational skills of someone who knew that saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could mean imprisonment or worse. When her father died in 1547 and her half-brother Edward I took the throne at the age of 9, the court became a dangerous, shifting battlefield of Protestant fervor, regency councils, and power-hungry nobles, all eager to manipulate or eliminate anyone who might challenge the fragile political order. And Elizabeth, as a visible figure of royal blood and growing intellect, found herself walking a very narrow line between cautious loyalty and the looming threat of irrelevance or treason. Her sister Mary, devoutly Catholic and fiercely proud, ascended the throne in 1553 after the brief and tragic 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, and almost immediately Elizabeth became the object of suspicion, a symbol of the Protestant resistance, whether she wanted to be or not. Arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London on the suspicion of supporting a rebellion she likely knew nothing about, locked in the very rooms where her mother had once awaited execution, with the shadow of death curling around her like frost. But Elizabeth did not break, she endured. She crafted careful, ambiguous letters, pleaded her innocence with just enough sincerity to be believed and just enough cleverness to survive, and after several terrifying months of isolation, she was released under what chat allowed to return to the countryside and resume her performance of obedience, all while knowing that her life could be ended by a single signature when Mary died childless in 1558. Elizabeth rode into London not merely as the last Tudor heir but as a survivor, a woman who had outlived the dangerous reigns of her father, her brother, and her sister, who had navigated the jaws of political and religious upheaval with nothing but her intelligence, her caution, and her relentless belief that she had been born for more than just exile or decoration. She was 25 years old, with auburn hair, luminous eyes, and a presence that could still a crowded hall with a glance, and she was queen from the very beginning of her reign. Elizabeth knew that she was expected to marry, not only because a queen ruling alone was considered unnatural, dangerous, and vulnerable to manipulation, but because the continuation of the Tudor dynasty and the peace of the kingdom seemed to hinge on the production of a legitimate male heir. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, refused to give her power away to a man, refused to tether herself to the ambitions of foreign princes or domestic nobles, and instead cultivated an entire mythology around her identity as a singular sovereign woman, declaring herself wedded to her kingdom, her crown, and her people, and spinning the narrative of the Virgin Queen with such masterful flair that it became not a deficiency but a divine asset. She kept suitors dancing on strings for decades: Philip II of Spain, the Archduke Charles of Austria, the Duke of Anjou, and others, dangling the possibility of alliance without ever sealing the deal, using her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool, a bargaining chip, and a cloak of independence that allowed her to remain above the of factional marriages in the court. She surrounded herself with men of wit, brilliance, and loyalty: William Sile, her advisor and anchor; Francis Walsingham, her spy master and silent blade; and Robert Dudley, her beloved favorite, a man whose intimacy with the Queen was the subject of endless speculation, jealousy, and whispered scandal, but whom she never married, possibly because she knew that even love, if formalized, could threaten her throne. And it worked. Elizabeth's reign ushered in a period of relative stability, economic growth, and artistic flourishing that became known to history as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a time when poets, playwrights, and philosophers bloomed like roses after rain, when William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Ben Jonson turned the English language into something new, alive and full of fire, and when theater's music and masque became not only entertainment but national pride. She navigated international waters with the same blend of charm and ferocity that had defined her rise, playing the dangerous game of European politics with St. running dexterity, supporting Protestant causes abroad without committing to open war, sponsoring explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, who claimed new lands and filled English coffers with gold and stories, and finally, when provoked beyond endurance, rising against the most powerful empire in the world, when the Spanish Armada sailed toward England in 1588, a fleet of towering ships meant to crush her reign and restore Catholic power. Elizabeth did not flinch. Instead, she donned a breastplate, rode to her troops at Tilbury, and declared in one of the most iconic speeches in royal history that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And when the Armada was defeated not only by English courage but by storms and divine fortune, the legend of Elizabeth was sealed. As the decades passed, Elizabeth remained unmarried, childless, and increasingly isolated, her old friends dying, her favorites fading, her throne safe, but her heart increasingly lonely. She wore her crown like armor, her powdered face and towering wigs a kind of royal theater, a spectacle to distract from the creeping frailty beneath, and though she danced less, laughed less, and trusted fewer than ever, she never stopped ruling. She died in 1603, aged 69, having ruled for 44 years, the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, and perhaps its greatest. She left no heir, but she left a legacy. Elizabeth I was not supposed to be queen. She was not born to rule, she was born a disappointment, the daughter of a disgraced mother and a father who had ordered that mother's death, but she transformed herself into Gloriana, into Astrea, into the Virgin Queen, into a woman so powerful, so luminous, and so impossibly brilliant that generations would look back at her reign and call it a golden age. She proved that a woman could rule not as a placeholder, not as a wife, not as a pawn, but as a sovereign. She took the broken pieces of a crumbling dynasty and forged from them an era of art, exploration, identity, and myth, and though her bloodline ended with her, her story became the stuff of legend. And so, dear dreamer, as the candle flame flickers against the velvet of night, let us remember her not just as queen, not just as ruler, but as a survivor, a woman of impossible will and endless brilliance, who changed the course of history simply by refusing to be anything less than extraordinary.